we cover the climate change issue a lot on this program, but we don't talk a lot about what a future world might look like that has been transformed by climate change. Returning to the show for the second time, or returning for the first time, appearing for the second time, is one of the leading science fiction authors of our generation. Kim Stanley Robinson has written a number of novels that involve the relationship between humanity and technology. His latest novel, which I have in my hand right now, is New York 2140, and we are going to discuss it right now. So first of all, Stan, thanks for coming on the program again.
Oh, my pleasure, Richard. It's good to be here.
And I want to ask you, before we go into the details of the novel, and obviously no spoilers, we have a no spoiler rule, but I'm intrigued. I have some theories. I'm about halfway through it now. I have some theories about why you wrote it, but I don't want to speculate. What motivated you to write this book?
I wanted to write a science fiction novel about global finance and how we could take it back into the nation-state system and democratic control, to put money in service of the people rather than of the 1%, to use a useful phrase from the Occupy movement. Well, that story is fairly abstract and global in nature, hard to turn into a novel. And my editor, Tim Holman, suggested to me that I locate it in the drowned Manhattan that I had briefly portrayed in my novel 2312, which came out in 2012. And that was a good idea because it gave me a local habitation and a name, a place where I could do some physical descriptions of what climate change is going to do to us, and also postulate that climate change is, for the most part, economic damage that we're doing to ourselves, that it's the dysfunction of our economic system rather than a matter of a sheer number of people or the technologies that we're using. It's more the economic dysfunction that is causing the problem, or is the main part of the problem. So these were my motivations.
Well, you know, that's really interesting to me, because in reading the novel, what I got out of it was, you know, there's a certain reading of the planetary crisis we face now, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, that basically lays the blame with technology. But the relationship between humanity and technology, I think in all your writing that I've read, and I've read a few things, and in this book in particular, is that technology is not the root cause. So that helps clarify for me that it can be the stimulus for the problem. It can also give us solutions to the problem. So in effect, the technology is value neutral, and that other forces determine whether it helps or hinders human beings in any given situation. So that makes sense, right?
Yes. Well, I guess what I would want to say here is that the main technology that is giving us the climate problem is the burning of fossil carbon. And we use that to create our electricity and to move things around. And it is a very easy and cheap form of energy and transport relative to the other ones. But we have invented clean substitutes to carbon burn already. And then the trick becomes, can we afford to pay ourselves to rapidly swap out one gigantic technological system? Because energy and transport and food are three of the biggest technologies that we have. Can we rapidly clean those up and make sure that they're not burning carbon and tossing that waste into the atmosphere? And this is where it's not profitable, it's not cost effective to do the survival thing. So that means that the pricing system that we're using is crazy, because essentially what we're saying to ourselves right now is, well, we can't afford to survive, or we can't afford to make a decent world for our grandchildren. And that means that the question of affording and how do you pay for things is really the crucial question, because the clean techs already exist.
Well, that sentence, that phrase, "we can't afford to survive," really deserves to be highlighted in some way, because it doesn't affect, kind of emphasize the contradiction in the financial system we got now. Now, again, without going into plot points, but just talking about the world that you create in this book, New York 2140. And again, we're talking with science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson. The world, basically the way I read it is, you're saying to the reader, look, let's stipulate that there was, as expected, as a result of climate change, a surge in the water levels, and that a lot of bad things happened as a result. But you're in effect saying to the reader, but this is not what we're talking about here. That what we're talking about here is, after that has happened, how does humanity react, and how does it continue to react going forward to the world that's been transformed, right? Is that fair too?
Yes. One of the points I wanted to make with this book is that we have a tendency to react to a big problem like climate change, a problem that can't be solved during our lifetimes. There is what you can call apocalyptic thinking that will essentially throw up your hands, say it's an insoluble problem, therefore we don't need to do anything. Because since the problem can't be solved, let's just party on, and the future generations can live or die. And there's a sort of end of the world mentality, like after us the deluge, so what? So what I wanted to suggest with this book is that after the deluge, there are still going to be human beings. They're going to be dealing with a terribly thrashed coastline and a refugee crisis of enormous proportions. So it will be a disaster, but it won't be the end of the world. And after that, people are still going to be trying to cope. And in the coping, they're going to be living interesting human lives. It will not be zombies and baseball bats and machine guns. It will be ordinary people that are our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, struggling to find happiness, struggling to find a partner, and having some fun along the way, because they'll be young, they'll be dealing. And that's one of the stories that needs to be told, so that we can then frame this story as one that will continue on after us, and where we still need to do everything we possibly can to hand on to them the best world possible. So, and one more thing I want to say is that sea level rise is on the way. It has been underestimated by the IPCC, and when we think about climate change, we're mostly thinking about the other deleterious effects of climate change. But what's been shown by James Hansen and other scientists around the world is that a rather modest temperature rise, like one we've already initiated, will sometimes result in quite massive sea level rises. And so I wanted to bring up that aspect of the problem also.
Yeah, and I think what you said is really important for a couple reasons. Number one is, I've had a number of climate scientists on this show, and we've talked a lot about the fact that the apocalyptic view of the future leads to despair, but sometimes, and therefore to inaction, as you just said, but they're not always in a position to address that, because their job is to analyze the data and tell us what's likely to happen. So it's the rest of us that do that. So in terms of keeping people energized to fight for a solution, I think that's a really important point, number one. Number two, I think the notion that the solution has to do with the way we envision economics and politics, and not just the science of it, is extremely important, because I think that's where people can understand they can't change maybe they can't change the geophysics of the Earth's atmosphere, but people can change our politics and the way we look at the economy and the global economy and so on. And thirdly, I mean, of course, it is coming. Sea levels rising, Hurricane Sandy. I don't think there had ever been before saltwater damage inside the New York City subway system. So, I mean, that is a wake-up call of a profound nature. Switching gears for a second, one of the things that I am really appreciating about the book is the sort of the way you make a world come to life of a submerged, partially submerged New York City in the future. And there's some other glimpses of the broader world too. But I worked in Lower Manhattan for many years. I lived on the Upper West Side. I know the neighborhood very well. And you kind of envision in New York where it's like Venice with canals and there are sky bridges connecting buildings. By the way, I worked in at AIG, we had 70 Pine and 72 Wall, and there was a sky bridge connecting the two buildings. So it felt very vivid to me, this description of the world, the boats and the transport and all that. And you talk a lot of, you describe New York, you set it up with the context of the tyranny of sunk costs, which is, an economic idea that it doesn't matter if it becomes expensive and impractical to live in a place like New York City. People are going to go where they've always gone because of that sunk cost fallacy that says, well, it's where we're supposed to be, right? I mean, is that a fair description of why you've your setup of New York there?
It is. I also, it occurs to me often, because I'm always only a visitor to New York, that it's not an accident that New York is where it is. The harbor is a big, capacious harbor. The estuary is beautiful. Between the natural landscape and the built infrastructure, it's a very beautiful, charismatic place. There's just no denying that. And people want it. New York has a charisma and a legend about itself, such that if it became, and I'm really just talking Lower Manhattan because Upper Manhattan is also physically higher. Lower Manhattan became like Venice, people would adapt and they would they would stick around. In fact, there would be maybe as many people as ever. So you get a different vision of New York, and the hassles that already exist in living in the New York area would be multiplied in some ways, and in other ways it would be kind of a clearing of the underbrush. There's no cars when you've got nothing but canals. So I wanted to do the science fiction exercise of just saying, what if sea level rise is about 50 feet, which is extreme but not impossible? What would New York do? And that in itself is an old science exercise, the what if, sort of just for the pleasure of the exercise. But since something like this is also coming down, almost inevitably, to a greater or lesser extent, it's worth exploring in advance the problems involved.
Oh, no question about it. It's better to play out all the different scenarios and see where we can go with that, particularly since one of them, as you say, to some degree or another, is going to take place. So I guess I come away from my reading of this novel. I don't think it's a polemic. I think it's a novel, but I think that, what I take away from it is we are changing our world in irreversible ways, but we better start thinking now about modeling new ways of organizing ourselves to deal with that. And some of those might not be bad ways to live, despite the fact that bad things are going to happen. What do you think?
Yes, I also wanted to tell this story as a kind of a driver to suggest what we could do to harness finance to human uses, by which I mean justice first and then sustainability over the long haul second. And the way finance now has delinked itself from the nation-state system, now that we're in neoliberal globalization, you have a free-floating group of investment capital that is devoted to highest profit, highest rate of return, and shareholder value. Well, these rubrics are wrecking the planet, and they create both injustice and lack of sustainability by wrongly pricing everything. Since we allow prices to float freely in a buyer-seller, supply-demand type balance, what happens is that the sellers have to set their prices as low as they possibly can to compete with other sellers and stay in business. Buyers need to buy things as cheaply as they can because a lot of them are immiserated or in the precariat and are poor. So that it's a conspiracy, an accidental conspiracy between buyers and sellers to set prices too low. And what happens is labor doesn't get paid for. So this is what's creating so many people who are too poor to do anything but pay the cheapest price. And then the environment gets priced too low so that we wreck the environment thinking that later generations can pay to restore it, and it's not restorable. So unfortunately, we're in the market system, we're in neoliberal capitalism, and yet that very system is pricing things so wrongly that our lives and the world are being wrecked. So without going into a complete spoiler, what you haven't got to yet, the second half of New York 2140 is the story of a plausible people's revolt to retake finance for human purposes and for the planet. So there is also a kind of a science fictional or utopian plan in the book as to how to do better.
And, you know, I'm looking forward to the second half now. And I will also close by saying, you know, we don't have to wait until the catastrophe happens to start doing that. So, well, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. But Kim Stanley Robinson, a science fiction author of the new book, New York 2140, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, thank you, Richard. Thanks for the opportunity.